seri-seri diskusi yang kita lakukan dalam periode pandemi ini. Dan betul harus berterima kasih ke Mas Fajar karena menghubungkan dengan banyak scholar-scholar besar yang selama ini kita baca bukunya aja, kita baca karyanya. Hari ini kita malah berkahnya ketika di work from home, seperti Pak Joshua Barker bilang, malah kita bisa ngobrol, bisa presentasi, bisa terhubung, yang kayaknya malah jarang kita lakukan di masa-masa sebelum pandemi ini. Jadi kalau kita bicara sebenarnya technological nationalism, saya kira nanti akan dielaborasi lebih panjang mengenai Pak Joshua. Tapi yang saya bayangkan adalah sebenarnya bagaimana sebenarnya pertautan antara imajinasi mengenai perkembangan teknologi, kemajuan teknologi, dengan cara kita membayangkan diri sebagai bagian dari negara bangsa. Dan ini adalah suatu hal yang sebenarnya sudah lama ada di Indonesia. Jadi kalau kita trace panjang, nanti Pak Jos mungkin bisa bicara lebih jauh, bahwa di masa lampau setiap pemerintahan selalu punya konsepnya mengenai bagaimana teknologi bertautan dengan kebanggaan kita sebagai warga Indonesia. Kalau risetnya Pak Jos soal Palapa, ada soal engineers dan lain-lain. Zulfikar Amir juga yang sempat kita undang beberapa waktu lalu sempat bicara mengenai technological state. Dan saya kira ini juga masih menjadi isu yang sangat relevan dalam beberapa tahun terakhir, terutama misalnya ketika Jokowi mempromosikan ekonomi digital, unicorn, dan semacamnya. Nah, bagi yang mungkin belum familiar dengan karya-karya Pak Jos basisnya adalah profesor antropologi di Universitas Toronto. Sudah lama sekali punya keterhubungan dengan Indonesia, melakukan riset di Indonesia, dan topiknya memang kajian yang terkait dengan perkembangan teknologi, bahkan saya kira sebelum istilah etnografi digital bahkan populer ya Pak Jos ya. Jadi sudah sejak awal 2000-an kalau nggak salah paling nggak. Nah, tanpa berpanjang lebar lagi, saya persilahkan kepada, sebelum selesai, jadi saya akan persilahkan kepada Pak Joshua untuk berbicara sekitar 1 jam. Nanti kita punya waktu 1 jam untuk tanya jawab. Bagi yang hendak mengajukan pertanyaan atau komentar, tolong dimasukkan di komen chat, menyebut nama dulu biar saya sebut namanya untuk kemudian menyalakan mikrofon dan videonya. Baik, silakan Pak Jos. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih. Jadi saya minta maaf karena saya akan memakai bahasa Inggris sekarang karena sudah lama saya tidak sempat ke Indonesia, jadi bahasa saya masih agak kaku. Tapi untuk bagian tanya jawab, saya senang sekali kalau saya bisa pakai bahasa dan menerima pertanyaan dalam bahasa Indonesia saja. So first of all, I would just like to thank you, particularly Ibu Narti and Bapak Fajar, but also to all of LIPI for the opportunity to speak with you today. LIPI has been very important to me as an institution. From the first time that I came to Indonesia in the early 1990s, I, had to go through the required processes for the research permission and so on. And LIPI was always very supportive. And more recently, I've had lots of interactions with colleagues there when I visited. So I really appreciate the work that LIPI does. And I want to thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today. My talk today is going to be a little bit schematic. My aim is not to present the results of a particular research project, but it's more to map out a terrain of research that I've been involved in on and off for many years. And I think it might be helpful here if I give you a little bit of a sense of the intellectual background that I bring to this research area. Because to some extent, I stumbled across it. It wasn't something that I had planned from the outset. The first part that I think is relevant to this particular topic is that one of the supervisors I had when I was doing my doctoral research at Cornell University was Benedict Anderson, who of course taught me a great deal about nationalism. And I think it's fair to say that almost all my thinking about nationalism has really been shaped by his thought. But then after I finished my time at Cornell, I had the opportunity to have a postdoctoral fellowship from the University of Twente in the Netherlands. And that was a collaboration between Twente University, which is more of an engineering college, and ITB. And that collaboration was with Program Pasca Sarjana Studi Pembangunan at ITB. I'm a social scientist, so it was unusual for me to be there, but I really enjoyed my time, and I was there for 3 years. And while I was at ITB, one of the goals of my time there, as part of this postdoc, was actually to work together with my colleagues in the Department of Studi Pembangunan to develop interest within Indonesia of science and technology studies. And that was a field of study that I was not yet familiar with when I first arrived in Twente, but I quickly took an interest in it. And there were 2 people that I worked with in Twente who were very influential in my thinking. One of them is an old Indonesianist and Professor Nico Skulp-Nordholt, who also had a lot of long-term collaboration with ITB, including an important scholar there, Hassan Purbo from the 1970s, who was very active in community development studies in the 1970s. But the other one was a man called Ari Rip, which you may not know. And he did visit Indonesia one time. But he was part of a school within, sort of a school of studies within the Netherlands, which was focused on science and technology studies, which at that time really had 4 centers of gravity in the world. One was in the US, actually at Cornell, there was, and at San Diego. Another one was in the UK at Edinburgh, and then there was in France with Bruno Latour. And then in the Netherlands, there was a group of people who worked in this area, and Ari Rip was one of them. On the Indonesian side, it was a collaboration with 2 scholars, 3 scholars, Pak Saswinadi Sasmojo, Bapak Wijayono Partowidagdo, and then a younger scholar who's probably closer to my age, actually a little older than me, Pak Sony Yuliar. And together we created a group there called the Scott Research Group, the Social Construction of Technology Research Group. And we invited some junior Indonesian scholars to be involved, including who is now Dr. Merlina Lim, who's at Carleton University, and Rita Padawangi, who's now at Singapore University of Social Science. So this was a group that was at ITB in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and we were conducting research on information and communications technologies in Indonesia with a main focus on the internet and the satellite. The satellite as an example of the kinds of telecommunication systems that had been built at the height of the New Order period, and the internet as the new technology that was really just getting very, very popular at that very time. And through that time at ITB, I became very interested in engineering culture. And it was really to better understand ITB itself and the academic culture that ITB had, because there were certain figures within ITB who loomed very large in this area. And one of them is one that I wrote about when I wrote about the satellite, who was Iskandar Ali Shiabana, the former rector of ITB during the New Order period, but also really one of the main people who promoted the idea of having a domestic satellite system in the country from the late 1960s when he first became a professor, up through the 1970s, 1980s, and then he was also involved in Pacific Satellite Nusantara. So a very active individual and a very impressive entrepreneur who left a very powerful legacy amongst his students at ITB. And at that time, you know, if you think about what was happening in Indonesia at that time, this was the time when, you know, pasca reformasi, where the Indonesian state was being quite transformed by the reformasi, the effects of reformasi. And I came from a Cornell where there'd been a lot of tradition of understanding the New Order state through the study of the role of the army in the state, because of course many government officials had been drawn from the army and the other military services. And I was quite interested to think of this Indonesian state in a slightly different way, which is to think about the influence that a different kind of institution, also very powerful with a deep history, namely ITB in this case, what kind of an impact ITB had had on Indonesian politics and state authority. And the way I'm a social scientist, I'm not an engineer, and so the way I approached this was in a way similar, what the phrase that sometimes comes to mind for me is Clausewitz, who says, war is a continuation of politics by other means. In some ways, I think for many engineers, technology is a form of politics by other means. And so that is a kind of approach that I bring to my scholarship on technologies. So part of this, then, of my interest in this area was trying to better understand how institutions like ITB shaped Indonesian history and politics. And then another part of it was that, I come from anthropology, and one of the things about anthropology is that it's always interested in critiquing Western-centric analyses. And I always felt that countries like Indonesia, who at that time, were considered part of the third world or global south, perhaps, that not enough attention was given in those countries to the role of local innovation and the role of local scientists and engineers in developing and modernizing societies. And I'm thinking here about people like, going back to President Sukarno, an architect from ITB, Iskandar Ali Shiabana, and then social scientists like Astrid Susanto, and then within the posted telecommunications, Willy Munandir, from LEN, which at one time was a part of LIPI, Sumaryato Kayatmo, and then of course you have the more well-known like Habibi, and then more recently, of course, Ono Purbo and the internet. And that really was also one of my interests, was telling the stories of innovation that have taken place in Indonesia. So that just gives you a little bit of a sense of my background and where I'm coming from and how I brought these two topics of nationalism and the study of technology together. So I think how I'd like to begin the more substantive part of my talk is just by giving you a list of 3 insights about nationalism, and then another 3 insights from science and technology studies that I drew from these different influences. On the one hand, from Ben Anderson on nationalism, and then on the other hand, through my engagement with people like Ari Rip and others in the field of science and technology studies. So in regards to nationalism, I think they're relevant to this talk today. There are really 3 things that I would like to highlight. One is that nationalism is a powerful form of imagined community, or what Charles Taylor later referred, after the book Imagined Communities came out, referred to more generically as a social imaginary, a way of imagining the larger society. It's a way of thinking about the imagined community that seems natural and given, but is in fact historically contingent and modern. So this is, Ben Anderson's major contribution initially in the study of nationalism, is to take something that people at the time he was writing, really took for granted as being something that they'd forgotten how recent it was. And he showed again how recent it was, and how the history of nationalism is in fact very modern. And more than that, he argued, and I accept this, is that it really was something that rested on certain technological developments. And I think in this respect, he was perhaps a bit of a technological determinist, in that he felt that the printing press, the advent and then the spread of the printing press, was an absolutely essential component to spreading vernacular language amongst a wide population in such a way that people could share that vernacular and feel themselves to be part of a single space-time, a homogeneous space-time. And so in that way, the printing press is a technology that lays the groundwork for the formation of a national consciousness. So that insight is the first insight I take from Ben Anderson. The second one is that nationalism is modular, in the sense that although historically contingent, because it emerges in different places at different times and with its own flavors and dynamics, nonetheless, it exists within a frame, a global frame, alongside other nationalisms. And this frame establishes certain expectations for what it should include. And he famously described these in terms very similar to Indonesian nationalism, one land, one people, one language. But also, with any nation must have its flag, it must have its anthem, it must have some concept of its national culture, and so on. And I think what we'll see in a few minutes is that in addition to those core elements of nationalism, one often finds a technological dimension there too, which is that you also need to have certain technologies. The third insight that I would like to draw from Anderson's work on nationalism is a distinction which I have found very powerful in my understanding of Indonesian society more broadly, and others have too, is a distinction between popular nationalism and official nationalism. And other scholars like Chalmers and Hadis, Bedi Hadis, for example, refer to official nationalism more in the terms of state nationalism. Popular nationalism is the nationalism of a social movement prior to taking control of the state. And in Indonesian nationalist history, for Anderson, it was associated with the Pemuda movement. And official nationalism is the nationalism, obviously, of the nation state. And it has more of an ideological function in the Marxist sense of that term. And then, you know, I mean, Anderson just drew that one contrast, but I also think that in the context of understanding technological nationalism in Indonesia, it's also useful to take Chalmers and Hadis's distinction between state nationalism and liberal nationalism. And this is really perhaps more of a continuum within state nationalism. And I think, you know, what we know from Indonesian history is that there was a progressive move from the mid 1960s, the beginning of the New Order, all the way through to the 1990s of liberalization, and within the overall frame of a state nationalism. So those are three insights that I take from Anderson on nationalism. And now I would like to turn to three insights that I take from the field of science and technology studies. And, you know, I will be honest with you here. This is a field where I am more of a dilettante. This is not I don't regard myself to be an expert here, especially in more recent work. But I was quite interested in it back when I was doing this research. And it's really impacted me strongly in terms of the overall way in which I understand society, as in terms that I really, you know, believe with people like Bruno Latour that you simply cannot do social science without taking into consideration material artifacts and technological systems. What in anthropology we now tend to study under the rubric of infrastructure, and which geographers and others have been doing for many years now. So turning to science and technology studies, you know, this is a field of study that came together from a mixture of different kinds of disciplines, but the main ones were probably sociology, history, anthropology, and in many cases, and philosophy. And in many cases, what's interesting about it was, at least in the early years, and it may still be true now, I don't know, it was very often, in a sense, people who have self-exiled from engineering or the sciences. They had started out their careers in those fields, and they had loved the science, they had loved the technology, but there was something about the field that they wanted to better understand the innovation process itself, and they didn't think, they came to understand through their experience that technological change and scientific discovery are processes that are driven not simply by, in the case of technology, some natural evolution of technology, or in the area of science, simply, you know, a value-free process of continual discovery and testing of knowledge, but that the construction of knowledge and the invention of technologies are fundamentally social and political processes, and that is what this field could, you know, was designed to address, was to better understand those social, political, cultural dimensions that were impacting the directions of scientific and technological change. So that's kind of what the field, how that field came into being. And three of the insights that I drew from the kind of early phase of scholarship in this area, one of them was, similar to the nationalism story, that technological innovation and change are not natural processes. So it's not like studying evolution in a natural world. They are highly contingent. And an important part of this contingency is that they are socially constructed to some degree. And there's been a lot of disagreement between how much they're socially constructed. And I think all scholars now pretty much are of the view that there's a kind of co-determination between technology and society, because society can push its own direction, but on the other hand, materiality and the limits of physics and other things do have a tendency to push back. So what this insight tells us is that in the study of technological change, we need to be attentive to different social groups and their different interests in relation to the development and diffusion of particular technologies. The second insight I took from this was that the social or cultural meaning of technology really matters. And this is something that comes easily to an anthropologist, that it's often contestations over the meaning of a technology that help to determine the way it changes over time. And this starts even with the very moment of so-called invention, because what science and technology studies scholars showed is that when you look at a given technology and its supposed invention, in fact, it's very hard to say exactly when something was invented in material terms. I mean, you can say when it was patented and so on. But the actual moment of invention is really hard to pin down because it's always a whole different set of steps. And you're always relying on pre-existing developments of one kind or another. And so the very notion of invention itself is something which is symbolically constructed. It's you make a claim to invention. And if you can convince enough people, and you can use lawyers to do that, then you can make a claim to being the inventor of television or of the telephone and so on. But when you look closely, those moments don't have the kind of fixity that you might initially think they would. And in addition to that, kind of, sort of related to that, is also just the notion that was really brought to the fore by people like Viba Baker and Trevor Pinch, which is that over the life cycle of a given artifact or a given technological system, the meaning that is attributed to that is likely to change. And in that process, what they described, and I think it's generally but not always true, is that very often at the beginnings of a new technology, there's a lot of flexibility in the system, and there's a lot of contestation over the different kinds of meanings it might have. But then over time, there tends to be a process of stabilization and kind of what they call black boxing, where the meaning becomes assumed, and the technology becomes part of what we think of as being infrastructure. That is something that's just given around us and that we don't pay attention to. but in that area, one of the things I've always appreciated, and I'll come back to this about Indonesia, is that that process of black boxing really isn't as successful in most cases in the Indonesian context. And I actually think there are elements of technological nationalism that are quite critical there. The third insight that I took from science and technology studies was that building any technology or technological system is, and really making it a part of people's lives, is a political process. It involves agenda building, creating alliances, mobilizing resources, and trying to affect political decision-making and economic decision-making. And so if you look at it as a political process, then it brings into view the incredible efforts that people like Ono Purbo for the internet or Iskandar Ali Shabana for the satellite, the amount of effort that they took to mobilize support for their vision for Indonesian technology was just remarkable. And not just those individuals, of course, it's a collective enterprise and requires all sorts of different actors. And so I was interested in understanding the different dynamics of that agenda building process. And the internet and the satellite are such an interesting contrast in that regard, because the satellite, you know, was very largely a top-down decision-making political process that came from Suharto, whereas the internet, from the outset, really was something that was part of a more of a popular mobilization that started at UI, at LIPI, at ITB, at UGM, and little groups of labs, people connecting with one another and connecting into the Indonesian diaspora in Canada, Germany, Japan, the US, all kind of working together to put together this new network. So that whole kind of political process, and then the way that the actors involved in doing that agenda building, the way they think about their work, really just fascinated me. And as I said, that idea of technology being politics by other means came through very strongly in so many of the interviews that I did with engineers, because people really had what now scholars like Sheila Jasanoff in science and technology studies refer to as a socio-technical imaginary, like an imaginary of how the whole society and its technology are going to be fitting together. And part of what they're doing is they're going out and trying to mobilize people to bring their vision of that socio-technical world into existence. And so when I looked at different technologies, and some of the ones that I've looked at in Indonesia in more detail are the history of the telephone during the colonial period. I've looked at Palapa, the satellite system. I looked at the early development, so in the sort of 90s of the internet. And I've looked at a kind of homemade technology, which some of you might know about, called intercom, you know, which is more of you know, it started out in village, you know, in sort of the peripheral parts of Yogyakarta, and then in Bandung, in the urban kampungs. So I've looked at different kinds of systems, from the most centralized high capital investment high interaction with, you know, American aerospace industry, down to the most basic village level, neighborhood level, where people take their own ampli and they merakit sendiri, their own technology. And then the ones that kind of move in between those, like the internet. So those are some of the key insights that I take from both the study of nationalism and the study of technology that inform what I understand to be technological nationalism. So let me just say then a couple of the ways that I look at technological nationalism. And I kind of look at it on the one side from the nationalist side, and then on the other side, I see it from the technology side. So on the one hand, I see technological nationalism as a strand within nationalism. Like, there are multiple kinds of nationalism, and technological nationalism is one of them. And it's one that focuses on, and I would say even fetishizes to some degree, like attributes a power to technology that is perhaps, you know, almost a magical power. That it's a strand within nationalism that focuses on technology as part of a political project to become modern. And so you can think about different kinds of nationalism, like racist nationalism, like white nationalism. We hear a lot about that now. We have religious nationalisms of various kinds. There are plenty of scholars who have shown how nationalism, many nationalisms, are fundamentally masculinist, and have a certain kind of sexuality attached to them. But from this angle, technological nationalism, I would say, is part of a desire to establish, or perhaps to engineer, an imagined community based on a shared commitment to the transformative power of technology. And you can see that the dynamic that you often see in a Jakarta or Bandung cafe, where you'll see a bunch of young people sitting around and looking at a device, whatever the new device happens to be of the moment. And they are all gathered around that, and that focus on that device is actually what's helping provide them with a sense of collectivity, with a sense of social belonging and connection. I think that you can have that same dynamic occurring at a national level. And it's a different way of orienting a collectivity around a common, in this case, object or imagined object. So that's one way of looking at technological nationalism as a strand within nationalism. On the other hand, you can think of technological nationalism as an approach to technological innovation that gives primacy to the nation as inventor. So rather than seeing, and again, this goes back to what I said a few minutes ago about the very notion of invention as being something that is, in many cases, you know, it really is a social construct. That in this case, rather than seeing technological achievements as being the achievements of individuals like Alexander Graham Bell or of a particular firm, you know, or a particular lab, let's say, that you see them most essentially as an achievement of nations. So you think of things like the Eiffel Tower, the Empire State Building, or here in Toronto, the CN Tower, which is The CN stands for Canadian National Tower. It's our tallest building. And in that kind of context, the claims of technological nationalism are to having achieved certain technological feats, certain amazing technological achievements. And there is, going back to what I was saying about nationalism being a shared frame along which you can see the other nations, and each with their anthem and each with their flag. You can also say we each have our tall building. We each have our boulevard, Jalan Tamrin, or the Champs-Élysées, or whatever. In that respect, there's something about nationalism which is sort of a little bit like, the things that one used to see in West Java when I was there in the 90s, in the villages, with different households, each with their antenna, the bamboo antennas that would go up, and it was a question of competing with your neighbors about who would have the tallest antenna, and that kind of competition that takes place. But of course, at the national level, this kind of competition was particularly important during the Cold War with the space race. And a lot of the technological nationalism in Indonesia actually does go back to that space race moment and the people who were heavily influenced by it. And you can still see it now, but it's taking different forms now. Like you think of SpaceX and how they, recently launched a rocket to the space station, and how the great innovation there was not that it was an American achievement, it was that it was a private sector achievement and not a state achievement, right? And so that's something that's quite different and unique about our current moment. On the other hand, there are other areas nowadays which are starting to look, again, very much like what happened during the Cold War, and even earlier than the Cold War, in the pre-Second World War era, of competitions over who will control certain communications infrastructures. And so you think about the competition over 5G technology in the cellular networks, and how countries like Canada and the US are trying to find ways to keep Chinese companies like Huawei out of that technological sector. And part of that, just as it was in the Cold War, was a concern with national security and message, the tapping messages and collecting people's information. That was also a concern in Indonesia with the satellite, taking on the satellite system, whether this would give the Five Eyes, including the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Britain, some sort of visibility into Indonesian communications. But that is a big concern now. But it's also, in many cases, of course, commercial and economic concerns masquerading as national security concerns. And very often those two dynamics are working together. And that was very much part of the story of the Indonesian satellite as well. So if those are two ways of looking at technological nationalism, I just want to also note that although technological nationalism, I think, is probably evident in most countries, in some countries it's much more powerful, a stream of nationalism, than in others. And there are differences in how technological nationalism kind of is oriented. And one way to understand these differences is to ask oneself, what is it that technology is going to deliver the nation from? Because the thing about technology is, more than anything, it has a tendency to throw into relief something that came before, something that we want to transcend and move past. And so just to give a contrast, in the United States, technology historically, and the US is, of course, the nation that's probably the most, or has been historically, just fascinated by technological change and so on, is that historically it's been seen, technology has been seen as something that would conquer the frontier. And the frontier was seen largely in terms of nature. And you think about railways as the European settlers pushed across the United States and subjugated and in many cases decimated the indigenous peoples, and who were considered in some sense to be part of nature. And so, but you also think of the great sort of lighthouse type projects that the United States has had, things like the Golden Gate Bridge or the Hoover Dam. And these are achievements, true technological marvels that are continually, by their very presence, showing how the human and the nation can dominate nature. And then, of course, landing on the moon was one of the most extreme expressions of this. But you can also see it in American involvement externally. And I think, I'm of my generation, one of the first big, the first Iraq War was one of the first wars that I was very conscious of as a younger person. And watching that on television and seeing the guided missiles dropping from the aircraft, and we were never shown the devastation that those weapons had, but what we were being shown was how American technology, high technology, can conquer the frontier, the new frontier, which was a global frontier. So that's what American technological nationalism consists of. So what then does Indonesian technological nationalism consist of? What is the flavor that it has? And here I have no, I'll be honest, my research has really been focused mainly on the 20th century. And so I look to the discussion period to learn more about the recent developments that you were describing at the outset, in terms of the plans for the digital society and the new kinds of infrastructure plans that the government has in mind now. They all sound very familiar in many ways, but I can't speak to them. But I think what I have looked at are things like, in my own research, as I mentioned, the various telephone, internet, satellite, and so on. And then, of course, other scholars who have done research also on the 20th century, people like Zulfikar Amir, Rudolf Mrazek, the historian, Abidin Kuzno on the urban landscape. I think all of us have kind of taken a similar view and have a broadly similar understanding of kind of the different periods that Indonesia has gone through in this regard. So if I look at the genealogy of technological nationalism in Indonesia, I do think that really through the different phases, Like if you go back to the revolutionary period, and then you go back to the old order, guided democracy, and so on, and then you move into the new order. And I think really in the new order, I think of it often as there were kind of two main phases. The phase leading up to around 1980, and then the malaria affair and so on, and then the phase leading until Suharto stepped down, and perhaps even beyond that to some degree. There's always been, I think, a kind of tension between two different streams, or I almost think of them as aliran, in the old Clifford Geertz sense. And really, you can really see these going back to the late colonial period, which is the time that Indonesian nationalism was emerging first, as well as the time that all the sort of most modern technologies, things like the train, the telegraph, the radio, the telephone, the automobile, the first airplanes, this was a time when those technologies were also becoming much more ubiquitous, much more common throughout what's now Indonesian society and cities, towns, villages, and so on. And so both nationalism and those new technologies were coming into being at the same time. And so inevitably, they became attached in certain ways. And through those attachments, I think I can see largely two different aliran. And the first one was characterized by a strong sense of enthusiasm. And enthusiasm in English, in a kind of, I guess it probably goes back to Durkheim or something, that notion of religious enthusiasm. Like it's the excitement that comes into being with when you're contemplating something that has almost supernatural or superhuman powers. And so the first current had this enthusiasm combined with this incredible desire to participate, to be part of it. And all the writing about early nationalism in Indonesia, and zaman modern and all that, the excitement that comes through in that, and the fascination with the new devices, as well as the new language, the lingua franca, with which they were often very closely integrated, because the newspaper and the printing press were integrated with the lingua franca, with Bahasa Melayu, as was radio to a certain degree. And so there is this kind of enthusiasm for a new medium, particularly in the area of communications technologies, but even in transport and so on, like where you ride the train together, which in a way is a medium as well, or a new kind of platform, where people from different localities who came from different local languages could communicate. And so technology has been part of that desire for connection amongst different regions and parts of the archipelago in this archipelago nation. And this enthusiasm was connected into the aspiration and the kind of commitment that we can all be modern, we can all be in this new space. And there's a kind of promise about this space in terms of possibly social equality, and a sense of what Anderson in the context of nationalism referred to as fraternity. or sorority, like that sense of being siblings rather than just say father-child, for example. So this hopefulness about participation in the shared modern age, I think, and this is something that I think has a kind of kernel of Indonesian uniqueness. Or it's not unique, but it's just so strongly developed in Indonesia, is a real culture of creative, what we call in English, tinkering, which is in Indonesian sort of merakit. It's that where you take things at hand, that you have at hand, and you make things out of them, and you make something new out of them. But it's quite a different, it's a process of what Levi-Strauss referred to as bricolage in some cases, rather than engineering. It's you work with things at hand and make things out of them, rather than coming up with a blueprint in your mind and then putting it into reality. But part of this tinkering is a kind of playfulness. It's not all serious. It's partly play, and this is when I wrote about intercom. Really, it was that playfulness that really I found most essential. And it doesn't, play can be very serious. We know that play can be very serious. But play, and also playfulness can be the basis of politics. And it can be the basis of collectivity. But very often I have found in my engagement with Indonesian innovators that they are the kinds of people who come with that background. It's kind of that, what nowadays is often called the hacker approach. So this aliran, in many ways, to my mind, like if I look back at the history, and I'm not a historian, so there are others who I'm sure can correct me in some ways, but also from what I've read by other scholars, it starts out as something that is it very often starts out as something that's kind of quite local in orientation. And so I think of even the history of the telephone, which was in large part, a history that started out like in the where I've studied it in the Bandung area. It started out on the plantations and connections within a plantation, and then from a plantation to the city, or to what was then just a town. And it was, it was done much like intercom was done. Like it was, you kind of build it for yourself and your own needs. And it was something that came out of the Dutch population at the time. And that's the early history of the telephone before the colonial state stepped in and created a monopoly and took it over, standardized everything, and pushed it out across the archipelago. And so it starts very often, this tinkering starts off as something local, but it also has the aspiration to be something, I think, that is global. And that's what we saw with the internet. Certainly, it was both very local and like in the ITB context anyway, and maybe it was unfolded differently in different places. But in ITB, it was very much about wiring the campus, but then also connecting the campus to the world. In fact, it didn't start out as a national thing, but that tinkering, that politics, that coming together, that sense of a shared vision did at a certain point kind of take a national form as well. So that kind of optimistic, playful, creative, hopeful view of transcending the past and moving into a new, better future was always, I think, a very strong strand within technological nationalism in Indonesia, a strong aliran. The second one and this kind of goes back to Anderson's understanding of nationalism, I think really gets traced back to the colonial state, you know, which provided a very strong frame for a lot of the technological development that took place in that period and also since. And this was a dynamic, and it was part of the state, but it wasn't restricted to the state. But this aliran was focused much more on being exclusionary, being hierarchical, and in the Dutch context, particularly escapist, and sometimes exploitative. And one way to think about this is there's a book by a man called, it's an old book by a man called Michael Addis, and it's called Machines is the Measure of Men. And it talks about the history of colonialism in various parts of the world, and how whenever the Europeans went out with their colonial projects, they always measured people by their technological advancement and found that they, as Europeans, were the most advanced and therefore superior. And it played into this kind of racial hierarchy. And certainly that was a strong dynamic in the Indonesian context as well. But even to the degree that I think in the late colonial period, very often Indonesians and the Dutch, you know, urban Dutch, there was more of a metropolitan culture of which they were a part. They were both a part, and everyone was participating in the new technologies. You think about Sukarno, you know, before the revolution. But within that, as we well know, within the modern, there was this stratification on racial or ethnic terms. And Rudolf Mrazek has written about that beautifully in the context of radio and the different channels that were created for the different ethnic groups and so on. Another dynamic here was the government, the Dutch colonial government, defending itself against critiques of colonialism, and wanting to show that it was advancing its colony. And this dynamic, I think, is something that plays out in regards to development of Indonesian peripheries in the post-colonial context. So this idea of using technology to transcend poverty and social backwardness. A third dynamic within this part within this aspect of technological nationalism is the desire for state control and very often a monopolization of new technologies by the state. And part of this is about actually wiring the state, making it more technologically able to exert social control. And one can show this process unfolding through particular technologies. That, you know, when you look at the history of the telephone and how it was rolled out, and how it really did connect government offices to government offices first, just like the telegraph did. Those were the main things. The other big area that the other sort of infrastructure that these were designed to connect together was the capitalist infrastructure, which in the colonial context and still in much of Indonesia today is fundamentally about extraction, resource extraction. And so it was about linking the capital city to capitalist peripheries, and the colony to the metropole. In that kind of, you know, you can think about it just in terms of almost world systems theory, building an infrastructure for that world system. And then, of course, within this aliran of technological nationalism, of sort of state technological nationalism, there was a tension particularly in the it was already evident in the colonial period, but it was also very evident in, say, the 1970s, between what you could call a state-driven and liberal projects, like a liberal approach, which would where developments could be, they would have the fig leaf of being national, but the reality was they were largely foreign. You think of, to some degree, IPTN and the armies of German engineers that they had on site, or Indonesia's early involvement in the Intelsat system, which were largely just foreign, and the space segment of the Palapa system, which were foreign innovations, in fact. But in the domestic side, they were the product of local industry. On the terrestrial side, they were the product of local industry. So, as I said before, I think in many ways, Indonesian technological nationalism can be seen as the kind of struggle between these two aliran. And at different moments in Indonesia's history, one or other has tended to be dominant, the more populist version or the more official state type version. And so, developmental nationalism in the old order, the whole notion of pembangunan and nation building that Ariel Haryanto has written about, where physical construction is invested with deeply political and even spiritual significance, and nation building in that it suggests that the construction of such things as modern factories or monuments, communication systems, and transport infrastructures, that the construction of these themselves will help to awaken and fortify nationalist consciousness. And this was the idea underpinning Palapa and the Wawasan Nusantara. But what you see is that over time, this kind of view of technological nationalism kind of becomes hollowed out. Like in the old order, you had a situation where Sukarno, when he came to power, was facing a very fractious political situation made up of these various different aliran, political and religious aliran at the time. And one of the things he sought to do was to use technological nationalism as a way of unifying and bringing people together, right? And this speaks to kind of what the flavor of Indonesian technological nationalism has been, is that quest for unity, the so-called unity and diversity. And it's by sharing that project of modernity. And it's, back in the Sukarno days, it was about berdikari, berdiri di atas kaki sendiri. And it was about cipta, national invention and creation. And it was about anti-imperialism and the social mobilization against imperialism, and mobilizing the productive forces of the nation through mechanizing agriculture, by developing Sistelnas, the Sistem Telekomunikasi Nasional, by having the Hotel Indonesia, by creating, by hosting the Asian Games, and then building a television system to be able to show the Asian Games, both within Indonesia, but then also internationally. So it had that dynamic of kind of this common frame of nationalism, of different nationalisms, and it was in dialogue with other countries in that regard, but it also had this strongly domestic aspiration. And so in the Dutch period, what had originally been, like, communications were very often seen as how the colony communicates with the motherland. It was all about, all the inventions were about radio, the radio connection to the Queen, you know, and that sort of thing. Whereas in Sukarno's time, like when he would do the ceremonies to celebrate a new telecommunication system, it would be about the brotherhood of nations, you know, connecting to another country in Africa or another country in Asia, as well as within the archipelago, connections from, you know, one end of the archipelago to another. In the new order, there was a real rebalancing, and that kind of more populist and kind of, we have to build it in our own way, and stand on our own 2 feet, kind of gave way to an embrace of a more liberal approach that embraced the capitalist development, and was comparatively less concerned with social and economic inequality, although those were often held up, you know, ideologically. But the focus was really on, you know, control, and this would, you know, so the satellite was developed, you know, with largely foreign investment, at a time when Indonesia could barely afford it, and so, you know, at the time anyway, it was criticized as being one of those, you know, just spectacular projects that had no bearing on people's everyday realities. And at the same time, there were still people like Iskandar Elisabana, like Kayatmo, and like the people who started in their labs and then went off and created their own firms in the private sector, who really wanted to use this opportunity to build up Indonesian domestic industry, and to reduce dependency on the metropolitan countries like the United States, Germany, Japan, you know, which are the main providers of telecommunications infrastructure at that time. And they did so. And for many, many years, and they were remarkably successful in their work. And it changed what ITB was. You know, it turned, ITB is quite remarkable in that way. How model that, you know, at least Iskandar Elisabana talked about as borrowing from, you know, he felt he'd borrowed it from Silicon Valley, and this is the old Silicon Valley, and implemented it at ITB, and created these firms, and Kayatmo, you know, Len kind of took shape out of that work as well. And they provided ground stations and TV station, you know, relay stations and so on. So as TVRI grew out, as RRI grew out to every last corner of the archipelago, these firms were very much driving this process. And it was not just, they would use nationalism as the justification, and national security as the justification, particularly in the more peripheral areas like Papua and Timor and so on. But in many cases, for the people themselves who were involved, it was also a big business. And so they just recognized that they could convince the government to spend a lot of money on these things, by raising the threat of communism or other kinds of threats that were popular at the time. So that kind of gives a little bit of a sense of that earlier period of the New Order. And then I think what you see over the latter phase of the New Order, you know, as many scholars have pointed out in other contexts, is a real attenuation of that, a weakening of that more Berdikari type approach to things, and more of a reliance on brokerage of foreign technologies, which then get kind of stamped with the label of Indonesia. And you think about the failed efforts to build a national car and that sort of thing, which sort of kept the language and the discourse of developmental nationalism and technological nationalism, but it sort of wore thin. It didn't really have the kind of power that I think when I read about the history from the Sukarno era that it had in that time. And so by the time that the internet generation came of age, you know, in the late 80s, early 90s, that this younger generation of engineers and you know, the people I knew when I was at ITB, it was like Ono Purbo was still there at ITB, you know, the son of Hassan Purbo, and Hassan Purbo as a community development, you know, one of Indonesia's biggest promoters of the idea of community development as against big state-led, big dam type development, was Ono Purbo. In his early efforts with the internet, he didn't define it in nationalist terms. You know, it was more local, and it was about community. It was about community development, and using community development methodologies and ways of organizing, but to achieve technological ends, kind of appropriate, you know, what was then called kind of appropriate technology approaches. And so I think the reason for that is because by that time, technological nationalism had become so hollowed out and lacking in spirit that it just it wasn't compelling anymore to young people. And much more compelling was still these same essential values of participation, the excitement of doing something new and creating a new egalitarian space and transcending inequality and so on. But that was defined as more of a local community level project rather than, and it was still berdikari to some extent, but it was at a community level. Well, that changed with reformasi. And you can trace it, and I have looked at it, you know, just sort of going back over the different phases in Ono Purbo's writing and presentations, where as reformasi became a powerful, you know, grew in importance, his whole discourse changed as well to take on the discourse of reformasi, and the internet became a tool of reformasi, and in that way regained some of the technological nationalism, but this time with a kind of enthusiasm and with a kind of spirit again. And yet, one thing I've always admired about him is he's always, you know, he left ITB and he's always refused to some extent to engage with the forms of co-optation that can happen with state projects, or at least for many years he did, and I don't know his current situation. And so, you know, that sort of retaining the spirit and the essence of that first aliran, I think is something that is always a challenge. And over time in a given society, and given in Indonesia, you see this kind of push and pull between these two aliran. And to my view, this is what kind of defines the technological nationalism in the Indonesian context. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Joshua. So for a little bit of overview, I think I made some notes from your presentations. So basically, Prof. Joshua borrowed the concept of Benedict Anderson, particularly on nationalism, to see that technological development is also imaginary. It is also a shared project, and there's also contentions between the one that's we call popular nationalism and then also state-led nationalism that also reflects on the politic aliran in technological development that we could see from even the beginning of the nation formation in Indonesia until after Reformasi, that there is always a tension between both aliran to reclaim which form of technological nationalisms shape the dominant discourse in society. And what I also take is ironically that after Reformasi, we could see how the idea of technological nationalism became much more state-led then instead of the previous era in New Order, when technological nationalism is built by the think-ring cultures that defines the unique characteristics of Indonesian technological culture. So prior to Q&A sessions, I would like to please the audience to turn on the video. There's a request from the administrators just for documentations. So please turn on the video just so we could see your faces, and it is used for our documentations. And then you could say your name on chat, and I would ask you to present your questions on video and audio as well. Oke, boleh tolong dinyalakan videonya buat para peserta yang hadir. Oke, sambil jalan ya. Pertama ke Mas Fajar, boleh silakan Mas Fajar, ajukan pertanyaan.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Joshua, for the very, very nice presentation and the way how you kind of bring us to a very long history of technological politics and nationalisms in Indonesia. I just have a quick questions, and then perhaps you can elaborate more. Talking about your two alirans in the trajectory of the technological nationalism in Indonesia, I kind of began thinking of the question of embodiment, because you're talking about the enthusiasms and also incredible desire of to participate. Actually, we are talking about the way how this kind of idea of progress, imaginary of technology is being embodied, you know. And I just kind of wondering if you could kind of elaborate more, because I think it's very important in the context of the current kind of a shift toward digital, you know, and more kind of a virtual spaces, in which the question of like, you know, like what Tom Bullstroff has already talked about, the different kinds of embodiment is continuing, but also at the same time it's different, you know. But can you kind of elaborate a little bit on these issues, whether there's a kind of a different ways of embodiment were taking place during the time before the internet came, and whether there is a different kinds of also embodiment taking place after the internet becoming more popular, or do you think that this, you know, there's no differences on this kind of two historical contexts? Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely. You know, I think there's a couple of things here, and you can go, I mean, in some ways, I always find it's easier to think about one technology by thinking about another technology. And so you can think about the internet, but I can think about, to think about the internet, it's sometimes helpful to think about intercom. And the culture of intercom that I found in Bandung, like in the early 2000s, when it was still, surprisingly, still in existence, was very much an embodied transformation. And one of the things that was so interesting about it was how it was a technology that was all about voice, swara. It really, it was fascinating to go around and like, because we had an intercom in my house, and so I heard it a lot because you know, there were people helping out in the house, pembantu and so on, and they would use the intercom system. And so I would hear it going all the time, and I would hear the beautiful voices, you know, people with these sweet voices, you know, radio type voices. And then when we went out and did interviews with the people who were part of this, who were largely, you know, kampung dwellers, you know, really at the peripheries, what were then the peripheries of Bandung, like high in the hills, really just on the edge of the city, still quite village-like. You know, they were people with very little money, and the devices would be sitting like, you know, in a room with very little furniture or anything, you know, the visual, how they appeared visually was so completely different from how their voice was. And so there was this capacity that people had through the new technology to become someone else. And they used a different handle, you know, a different name for themselves when they were on that line, much in the way that people did in the early phases of the internet as well. So I think that and in that case, it was very much tied into the body, and sort of, in a sense, freeing people of the body, but still having the voice. And the voice culture that it was building on was really the whole history of radio in Indonesia, which was has been such a powerful voice medium in Indonesian society. So I think that embodiment is absolutely critical to these changes. And I think, you know, in the current context we all find ourselves in now, like, I mean, I literally spend 12 hours, 14 hours a day, you know, on Zoom or things like Zoom. It's quite something. And it's different from, you know, when we used to do Google Hangouts once in a while. You start to feel a different, it becomes more a part of your practice and who you are, and becomes so normal that I actually am starting to feel more anxious about returning to real human face-to-face. And in many ways, that anxiety that I feel is similar to how people, when I was studying intercom, how they felt. They'd much rather, they only wanted to interact on air. Yeah, we don't want to meet on land, you know.
Okay, thank you. Oh, just quick question, sir. Do you think that this somehow can be linked to the topic of avatar. You know, it's talking about the visuality. You're talking about the embodiment through voice, but we also talk. You can also in the internet time. You know, you have a notion of being someone else through avatar. You know, not necessarily through the voice, but also through different kind of appearances.
Definitely, and you know, I think it's always important. Like whenever you start to look at a given technology very closely, a different medium very closely, there are definitely what science technology scholars sometimes call affordances. Like, one term that I've seen used also that I really find helpful is enabling constraints. So aspects of the actual technology itself, of its material capacities, like with Zoom, you know, the way it allows you to have the tile view, like the view where you get to see all the different faces. That was its great innovation, right? And that's what drew everybody to this new format. Those affordances, like what the technology allows for, are both a kind of constraint. Like you can't touch the person. My son, he described, like, because he had to start to go to school online. He's 10 years old. And he said, I don't know if you know, well, you know, because Jakarta, they have it in the malls, bowling. He described it as being like bowling, where the ball, you see the ball going and it looks like it's going to hit the pins, but then it just doesn't quite hit the pins, right? So the experience of being on this medium in a classroom versus being in person in a classroom it's just, you feel like you're just missing out on something. You're just not quite connecting. But on the other hand, there is so much that is enabled here by the materiality of the medium that you know, we only can ever understand one medium in terms of the past ones, right? Like we have no other language to describe it, so we're always referring back to the previous ones, and I think it's always interesting to be thinking about what is newly enabled, and how you can kind of break out of the path dependency that has been brought by earlier technologies. And so it's like in the history of the telephone, what happened was, in the Indonesian context, was it actually started off as intercom. Like basically, it was intercom for the Dutch plantation owners and their wives. And it was largely for women to, you know, women were communicating on the telephone in that early days when it was still these little tiny private networks, you know, Maskapai, whatever. And then when the government stepped in, what they did was they started overlaying, the telephone became a supplement to the telegraph. It became a telegraph for the people who didn't know Morse code. So they would, you know, you'd phone and then someone would write it down rather than using Morse. And so, but the lines they would, like the cables they would draw, that they would build, would follow the telegraph model. And the telegraph had been built for the state, for state communication, as well as for capitalist communication. And so then the telephone started taking on the path dependencies that had been created for the telegraph, and the full possibilities of telephone technology were not realized until the cell phone. You know, I mean, where it became much more flexible and ubiquitous, and people could text message, like all the possibilities that came really were only opened up again 7 or 8 decades later with the advent of the cell phone.
Oke, terima kasih Prof. Yusra. Selanjutnya Bu Wija. Bu Wija.
Oke, Pak Joshua, boleh saya bicara dalam bahasa Indonesia?
Boleh, terima kasih.
Sebetulnya saya agak bingung untuk melihat konteks teknologi nasionalisme pada masa sekarang ini gitu. Nah, saya agak sedikit bertanya-tanya tentang konteks makna dari modern. Jadi misalnya ketika kita dulu Indonesia dulu itu baru mau maju, teknologi dan modern itu menjadi suatu kaitan gitu ya. Kalau saya punya teknologi berarti saya modern gitu kan. Terus ketika Orde Baru, ketika saya punya teknologi, saya mau kontrol, saya mau Nusantara, saya mau persatuan, kira-kira seperti itu gitu.
Yeah.
Nah, yang saya tidak mengerti adalah situasi sekarang ini. Jadi sekarang ini kira-kira kemodernan orang Indonesia itu seperti apa gitu? Karena teknologi itu kemudian menjadi seperti orang Barat melihat teknologi. Dia menjadi standardized, dia exclude people gitu kan. Dia measuring people gitu. Terus dia memarginalisasi sebetulnya. Jadi ada kelompok-kelompok orang yang nantinya di Indonesia itu akan jadi problematik karena di-exclude oleh teknologi. Misalnya orang yang tidak memiliki akses ke internet. Gitu. Sebentar lagi itu akan mereka barangkali akan dilepas oleh pemerintah Indonesia dalam konteks mungkin pekerjaan, mungkin penghasilan. Gitu. Nah, jadi saya sebenarnya bingung melihat kenapa orang Indonesia itu sekarang ini seperti itu. Apakah memang sekarang ini adalah satu masa di mana modern itu baru terjadi di Indonesia. Dulu tuh cuman kata-kata gitu, cuman politics. Jadi sekarang tuh real time, real apa gitu. Kira-kira seperti itu, Pak.
Ya, jadi saya juga ada pikiran. Jadi kita kan di dunia ini, walaupun masih, ya betul sekali bahwa masih ada digital divide, tapi dunia sekarang sudah tidak seperti world systems theory dulu, dengan where certain nations are underdeveloped, other nations are developed, and high value industry, like high value industry is located in the metropoles, and low value agriculture and primary production is taking place in periphery countries. Now every country has its own dynamic, which is actually very similar to what world systems describe, but it's within the country, it's within the city, it's even within the neighborhood. Those kinds of social inequalities. So there's definitely still a digital divide, but the countries like Indonesia are more wired than countries like Canada in many ways, and the amount of time that people spend on social media and so on is greater in Indonesia than it is in Canada. So at this time, I think it's a good question to ask, what does it mean to become modern when really, I mean, is there anything about us that isn't modern? It's kind of, I think it's similar to kind of how people think about, you know, the age of the Anthropocene. That is the age of that we're in, where humans are so determining planetary nature, that we're in an age of the human, like where it is really a human age, and whether the planet can survive, we don't know. And technology in some ways has become so ubiquitous, it's been so widespread that there is no exterior to it. It's all within. We're all within that world of technology. So the old ideas about pursuing a modern, to me anyway, they seem a little bit nostalgic and kind of old-fashioned. And in a way, one could ask, what are they nostalgic for? Well, they're nostalgic for a time where we felt we could all join together in a common project towards modernity, with a sense of linear time and making progress. And look at us now. We're stuck in our homes. Everyone across the world, you know, has been stuck in their homes. We're much more, I think the moment we're in right now is the moment that Rudolf Mrazek described in his book, which was right as the Second World War was about to break out, or had broken out, but it had not yet arrived in the Pacific region, and how the Dutch colonial population in Java, all they could do is sit in their homes, probably in Bandung Utara and Kebayoran Baru, and listen to the radio. That nice, flashy object that they were all so fascinated with. And they used it in part as a form of escapism from a very harsh reality that was outside and coming their way. And so I know this is not such an optimistic view, but with the pandemic, I think we can see how that part of technology as a zone of retreat and escape from a world, like currently it is a war, but it's not a war between people, at least not where I am. I mean, in some places there are wars going on. But this is a war between a virus and human bodies. And it's a very harsh war. It's you know, there are more people in the United States that have died than in all the wars that the US has been involved in since Vietnam, like just from this virus. So that harsh reality in those kinds of environments, I think what Rudolf Mrazek showed is that people will sometimes retreat into what seems like a safe world of technology.
Terima kasih.
One
Selanjutnya,
question.
Oke.
Boleh satu lagi?
Boleh disusul nggak, Bu?
Begini,
Karena antrinya
Pak
panjang sebenarnya.
Joshua.
Bu Ija, maaf.
Oke.
Boleh disusul nggak kalau ada waktu lagi?
Ya, berapa?
Ya. Oke.
Ya,
Selanjutnya,
nggak apa-apa.
Yonike.
Thank you, Mas Ibnu. Good morning, Pak Joshua. It's also morning in my place. I'm in Evanston, Northwestern.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. So thank you so much for your explanation. I've been reading most of your works, and you're actually one of my inspirations to the history of science. And actually, my question related to the previous question, but more on the the temporal strain of technological nationalism. So because like you mentioned, we are aware that technology is diffused into people's everyday life, and this process is not necessarily similar. There's a different access and ability to participate, not only racial, but also gender hierarchy. And I'm wondering if we go back to Anderson's argument on empty homogeneous time and the story of nationalism as a synchronous process, this seems like a bit distorted because apparently through technology, we can actually pinpoint plural departure points of imagination. So it's at the same time synchronic, but at the same time also distorted. So I'm wondering, what do you think about this temporal tension when we're thinking about technology and nationalism? Thank you.
Thank you very much. You know, I completely agree. Like I mean, I actually think the current moment we're in now is more synchronous than any we've experienced globally since probably the space race, when then, even then, it was only people who had radio and television, right? And which, if you think, I don't know what the statistics are, but it must have not been a huge percentage of the world's population, and newspapers. But there's, at that time, there was still so many rural people who didn't have those connections. And then I also think back to the late 19th century with Krakatau, and that moment of a natural disaster that had truly global scope, like the ashes from Krakatau and traveled all the way to North America, and the news about it traveled via the telegraph. So I think we are in a moment now with unprecedented simultaneity, and the pandemic also has a kind of, I mean, it's not technology per se, it's more medical science and public health knowledge, but the ability to kind of put every country beside every other country and see how they perform. You know, and China is very gung-ho about wanting to show that it's going to get this thing under control. So I think that simultaneity is very important. But as you say, this is, I think Anderson, he was very optimistic about nationalism.
Yes.
I mean, and the reality is, and what I think scholars who wrote after him and critiqued him and so on are absolutely right, that and this is something that kind of complicates what I was presenting earlier as well, which is I presented it very much like the things that distort that equality and that hopefulness and so on, the positive side of it, that all of those come from the state, the colonial state, right? And that's what Anderson argued, basically. So when in his second edition of Imagined Communities, where he incorporated this colonial state into it, the colonial state became the source of all the hierarchy and all the more repressive qualities. And it was because he was coming to terms with the New Order, I think. However, my other supervisor, James Siegel, the anthropologist, he had a different argument. And he had, they were friends, and he had a friendly critique, I think, of Anderson, but in his book, Fetish Recognition Revolution on Indonesian literature and the lingua franca, he argued that in fact, the hierarchical dimensions and those repressive dimensions that Anderson attributed to the colonial state, that those were also present within Indonesian nationalism itself. And in that sense, you can't understand the violence of the New Order regime without recognizing that that repressive, violent possibility is also part of what Indonesian nationalism was historically. You can't just blame it on the state. And so I think we have to be really thoughtful about that point. And just as a kind of final sort of just aside, really, one of the things, I'm now a university administrator, you know, as much as a professor, and one of the things that I've been really thinking about a lot in the context of the pandemic, as we've had to shift all our teaching and much of our research online, is the new forms of social equality that are layered upon the old ones. As we all enter into the cyber world, and not just the cyber world, but the actual virus itself and who it targets. You know, in the United States, African Americans. Very often the poor, and a lot of that has to do with the social determinants of health. But some of it may even be, you know, what blood type we have. Apparently people with blood type A are much more susceptible to getting bad cases than other blood types. So things that don't break down just on race lines, but even just a part of your genetic makeup. So as we think about trying to create a new space, a new university, like in my world, we try to create a new university online. All the mechanisms that we've had to deal with students who might be having mental health challenges, or they might have a disability, they might be a woman in science rather than a man in science. We've had programs in place to address those inequalities, usually not nearly as well as we should have, but we've tried. But now we have a new layer, and I think it's a good example of how when you enter onto a new platform together, with different set of enabling constraints, very often the old inequalities persist, but also new ones take shape that you wouldn't even thought of before. And you have to open your mind and see that as a policymaker and try to focus on that and develop policies around that. Thank you.
Terima kasih. Selanjutnya Erina Aprilia. Boleh dinyalakan mic-nya? Bisa dinyalakan mic-nya? Oke. Oke, di skip dulu. Nanti kalau bisa nyalakan, tolong kabari lagi. Next is Onat Kibaroglu. I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name.
No, sounds good. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor. Such a brilliant account. You mentioned technologies tend to go from sort of like a creation phase and then like a contestation phase regarding what they are, and then they settle down and tend to become infrastructure. What I'm sort of currently noticing and actually studying as well is that maybe we're seeing an inverse trend in Indonesia currently, especially with I think most saliency with Gojek. I feel like it became even more noticeable, more salient, more flamboyant, even maybe, especially globally, more of an arena of like contestation as it became infrastructure. Because usually infrastructure tends to be like sort of silent, unnoticeable. But last time I was in Jakarta, it was February. I was kind of lucky with the timing. People were almost treating the MRT as like a site of tourism, myself as well. So I just wanted to see the MRT. I didn't have to take it, but I just took it. So I'm from Turkey, so in Turkey we have this as well. So usually infrastructure, especially in the global south, tends to be some sort of even more noticeable, even more flamboyant as it becomes, it moves through that sort of trajectory. We didn't really have that with the internet. I think it didn't really have a face, right? It didn't really have a brand. But as we have these sort of new, I think, everyday technologies, let's say, as they become infrastructure, they become even more noticeable. Would you agree with that sort of maybe, I don't know if it's a novel trajectory, but there might be a sort of different trajectories of the same phases.
That's right. And I think, I mean, there's a couple of things there that you say that really resonate with me. One of them is, I think you really have to look at the specifics of the technology itself. And, you know, a lot is made, I think rightfully so, about the internet, broadly speaking, and you think about something like Gojek as being, you know, a technology that is of the internet fundamentally, as well as the motorcycle, and but it's a highly distributed system, and so you know, and it was built to be that way, you know, by the U.S. military, and so that idea of a distributed system means that in many cases, invention takes place at the diffusion stage. Like, you know, in the classic model from innovation to diffusion, it just doesn't work in the kind of decentralized systems that we have today. And I think one of the things that like Ono Purbo's group and others and people globally who were involved in building out the internet in all countries, they were always trying to keep it open and evolving in new ways. And it's only really with the domination of the global infrastructure of like all the undersea cables and so on by Facebook and Google and others, where that kind of corporate control is beginning to resemble something similar to what existed in the time of telegraph cables for states, or existed in programming on television for channels, right? You know, I mean, basically, a lot of the internet looks a lot like television now, in terms of the lack of variety, in terms of how people actually use it. So, so I think that there is a kind of openness that comes with particular technologies more so than with others. And it can be part of the entire design. Like, of course, Apple is very well known for really trying to, I guess it's not black boxing, they white box their technology, quite literally. And, you know, it's impossible to get the battery out and so on, and you have to be a hacker to do this and that. But the other side of that is, I think, you know, kind of what we talked about, and I think what you're suggesting as well is that there is something about the tinkering culture, which is always trying to repurpose both the materiality of the artifacts and their meanings. And Indonesia is where the experts are, as far as I'm concerned, in this area. And so how, you know, the meaning of a new technology, you know, the government or a given company might try to give it a certain meaning, but it'll be recast. People will find a way of working with both language to change its meaning and with the material artifact itself to reinvent it, even in its diffusion stage.
Yeah.
Oke. Kita sudah jam 9, tapi kalau Pak Jos tidak keberatan, saya kira kita masih bisa menjawab 2 pertanyaan lagi. Satu dari Erina, satu lagi dari Pak Iqbal nanti. Karena Erina ada masalah dengan audio, saya membacakan pertanyaannya, Pak Jos. Bagaimana menurut pandangan Bapak dengan masyarakat yang menolak peradaban modernisasi, seperti di suku-suku pedalaman yang ada di sebagian pulau terpencil Indonesia? Terutama dengan kata-kata untuk membuka keterbukaan informasi terhadap pedalaman tersebut dengan pelajari kehidupan kebiasaan mereka dalam kehidupan sehari-hari.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I was thinking earlier also during one of the other questions, one of the things I haven't studied as much as I wish I'd studied so far is the Baduy in Jawa Barat. Who have made it, they are nationally known, certainly, and to some extent internationally known as a group in West Java who has rejected modern technology. And then I think about groups within the United States or Canada, for example, where you have some religious groups, the Mennonites and some others, where they have villages, that they created centuries ago, which continue to function, and they're connected into the economy and so on, but they don't use automobiles. They use horse and carriage, and so they decided to keep themselves at a certain level of technological development and not to kind of exceed that particularly. I mean, I don't have a lot of kind of actual ethnographic understanding of those situations, so I can't particularly speak to them well. But I mean, part of what I think about in the current moment is how this is a good example of why we need such diversity as a human, as human beings on this planet, because there, under certain circumstances, the communities that have self-isolated from modernity have in fact, fared better than the cities. I mean, COVID, at least in its initial wave, is most of all an urban phenomenon. In terms of its terrible impacts, you look at the United States and how the worst impact is New York City, and the urbanized, West Coast and so on, and so you begin to think how groups like the Baduy are actually kind of well positioned in the current moment compared to where I'm at, which is in a big city in North America. And so if we think about sort of the overall future of our humanity, and how if we have all our eggs in one basket, as we say, it is very dangerous. And so having different social ways of organizing socially, and allowing those to be, and providing space for that true diversity, and some of that might be in terms of culture, some of that might be in terms of how people organize themselves economically, how production takes place. I think it only makes us more resilient.
Oke, thank you. Pak Iqbal, terakhir. Pak Iqbal.
Ya, terima kasih. Bisa kedengaran suara saya?
Bisa, Pak.
Bisa.
Ya, Pak Jos, kalau kita lihat bangsa-bangsa besar, termasuk Indonesia, itu kan pembentukannya sangat dipengaruhi oleh teknologi. Waktu sesudah proklamasi misalnya, pemuda-pemuda Indonesia itu yang dilakukan pertama kali adalah merebut RRI, stasiun radio. Nah, kemudian kita lihat juga Bung Karno itu juga sangat memanfaatkan, karena dia juga penulis, memanfaatkan teknologi cetak ya, dengan menulis di koran dan juga menggunakan mikrofon, karena dia juga orator dan memanfaatkan radio juga. Nah, kemudian Soeharto juga seperti yang Anda tulis kan juga menggunakan satelit untuk lebih mengikat Indonesia ini gitu ya. Nah, teknologi-teknologi tersebut adalah teknologi yang sangat hierarkis gitu ya, sangat ini ada konsentrasi kekuasaan, itu sangat merepresentasikan konsentrasi kuasa. Nah, perkembangan teknologi terbaru itu kan memberi memberdayakan atau empower individual tuh untuk mengekspresikan suaranya gitu. Siapa saja tanpa harus diwakili oleh siapa saja, tanpa menunggu didatangi wartawan atau didatangin siapa. Jadi siapapun bisa mengekspresikan dirinya sendiri. Nah, kita lihat sekarang misalnya apa yang terjadi di Amerika ataupun di Inggris dan juga di Indonesia, itu media sosial itu sangat berpengaruh pada fragmentasi ataupun polarisasi dalam masyarakat kita tuh. Dan itu seperti banyak negara juga kesulitan untuk menghandle polarisasi tersebut. Nah, kalau kita lihat di awal, teknologi itu sangat mempengaruhi nasionalisme, our sense of nations. Nah, bagaimana apakah perkembangan teknologi baru itu akan mempengaruhi definisi kita tentang definisi kebangsaan kita atau masyarakat kita? Dan dalam konteks Indonesia, bagaimana menurut Pak Jos, apakah ini bisa baik atau justru mengancam keindonesiaan ini? Ya, itu pertanyaan saya. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much. That's a big question, and I really appreciate it. I think I have kind of two answers. One more directly to your question, and the other one a little bit off to the side. I think in the area of unity and togetherness and being able to come together as people to address the challenges that we have in our societies, which are fundamentally not about our capacity to produce enough or to create wealth overall. It's fundamentally a problem of distribution and social inequality. And what I see in the media, media social and the other arenas is I guess I'm a little bit more on probably the Ono Purbo side of things, perhaps unsurprisingly, in the sense that I'm very suspicious of corporate media ownership. And you see this now. It's very interesting in the United States, where this polarization is so intense, like with President Trump and all his followers, and the supports that are being given from foreign actors. I mean, Russia, as well as domestic actors, billionaires who have particular economic interests in trying to keep him in power, and how they're using social media by purchasing Facebook ads and by funding bots and other ways to divide people. And I think that if, and they're similar, you know, I don't know the details, but I've read about similar things and armies of, you know, Indonesians who are, you know, can be hired to help generate a certain kind of meme online and that sort of thing. And that kind of economic power, when exercised in a medium which is not being held accountable for what it publishes, like Facebook, because they early on were not classified in the same way as a newspaper or a radio station was classified, and therefore were not regulated in the same way and are not responsible for the content they publish, I think has led to a situation which is really quite dangerous for democracies and for the unity of nation states. And on the other hand, I remain optimistic that if those powers were reined in, and if there were not billionaires spending millions of dollars to try to mobilize armies of Twitter followers and fake accounts and that to try to divide people, I think for the most part, people would come together in a positive fashion if it were a collectively or publicly owned infrastructure, which everybody had access to, which really ought to be what the internet is now. So that's one part of the answer. The other part, which is not directly to do with the question of kind of social division and unity, but goes back to world systems theory and global social inequality and extraction. So, because you know there was the side of technological nationalism, which is focused on more the identity side, but or sort of state nationalism that focuses on trying to, you know, provide a homogeneous view of a national identity. But there's also this extractive side economically. And I don't think, you know, you really can't look at the history of technology. I mean, someone put in the chat, I think, you know, reminded people that it's very important to recognize that these technologies all came, many of them came from the military. They were all about war and domination. But the other side of that is that that's absolutely true in the history of technology. And then the other thing is where they go from war is to capitalism and very often to extraction of one sort or another. Now, what I'm worried about with social media is the information economy is such an enormous economy. You see where who the largest corporations are now, and the ones who are becoming even larger and more powerful in the current environment. And the reason they're able to become so wealthy and still deliver these services for free or very low cost is because they are extracting all of our information, and that includes on this very call. So, you know, that there's a marketplace for all that information, which is largely invisible to all of us, both in the first world and in the third world. And so Google, Facebook, there's a secondary market where they sell all this information. And a lot of it is to advertisers, but some of it is now to billionaires who want to stoke political rivalries. And it's a very dangerous economy. But it is, I genuinely see it. There's a woman what's her name is just escaping me. A Harvard Business School Zubinov, or maybe someone, but she has a book called Surveillance Capitalism. It's an excellent book, and she's describes how this new mode of production, this new mode of extraction, is very analogous to imperialism, in the sense that during the time of the old empires, of the European empires, arriving in a country like the Americas or Indonesia, and then carving it up, like maybe they had no system of land tenure as such. It was usufruct or whatever. And then they just carve it up and give it away to their cronies, their military cronies. And then all the agricultural produce is extracted to the metropole and so on. So that was, so you enter into an area where people don't have the same view of what value is. And then you just, before they even know what's happening, you take it all away and you carve it up for yourselves. And that's what's happening with information, with individual information. In my earlier research, before I started studying technology, I studied policing. And one of the things I looked at was the history in Indonesia, of how, like, when did the colonial government, when did it first start to get information on individuals, right? Because in the early, up until the late 1920s, in most parts of the country, it was still, even the taxation and everything was still based on villages. Like, the village head would get taxed, and they had to do the individual extraction. It was only with public health measures, because they had the issues of the plague, and they needed to vaccinate individuals. It was only then that the colonial government took an interest in being able to identify people down to the individual, and then start collecting information on those people. And the only thing that mattered was, name, address, and have you been vaccinated. And then you see how that evolved over time to the identity card and the kartu keluarga, and how that played out in the anti-communist times and so on. But still, even in the early 2000s, what individuals level data, or even today, does the Indonesian government have about its citizens? Very limited. What does Facebook have about Indonesian citizens? A lot. Yeah. A lot. And that information is being bought and sold. And so all the things we do in this environment, we have to recognize are being done in an environment where extraction is taking place constantly. And that's why those corporations do have the capital concentrations that they have. And that's how, and it's using that money that they're building the submarine cables across the world by which all the data is being transported. And they now have control over those pipelines. They're like oil pipelines, but they're information. The scale of inequality that we're witnessing today is even worse than colonial times. Although in that time between, everyone has been elevated. Virtually everyone has been elevated.
Okay. It's quite a grim outlook, I know, but it happened to all of us. So I think we have very fruitful discussion we thank very much to Prof. Joshua to share his ideas and thinking. And as we could see that even until today, that the ideas how nationalism entangled with the imaginary of the technological development is still very much relevant. So I think it opens up also the possibilities to do further studies on a lot of different subjects as well. Before I close this discussion, I would like to give opportunity to Bu Narti to give proper closure. Please, Bu Narti, the time is yours.
Thanks so much, Mas Ibnu. Pak Joshua, thanks so much for the inspiring presentations and widen our knowledge on how technology affect the life of people and also for the nation building in this context. So I would like also to thanks to Pak Mas Ibnu and also for everybody who participate in this lecture. And I really hope that it will not the end of the will not end only this time, but we still continue to communicate with Pak Joshua, because Mas Ibnu has mentioned before that we have a particular project on social change in the digital era. So we would like to we will continue to communicate with you about the interrelation between society and teknologi digital. Once again, thanks so much for everybody. Terima kasih banyak pada yang sudah hadir partisipasinya. Thanks also tentunya pada Pak Fajar yang menghubungkan kami dengan Pak Joshua sekali lagi, dan teman-teman semuanya baik dari LIPI maupun yang dari luar yang telah sabar untuk mengikuti. Ya, sebetulnya masih banyak yang akan kita gali, tetapi waktu juga yang menyebabkan kita ya. Jadi perbedaan waktu yang Pak Jos masih jam 9, jam 10, kita sudah jam hampir 10 malam. Jadi itu sekali lagi terima kasih banyak dan mohon maaf kalau masih ada banyak kekurangan dalam penyelenggaraan ini.
Ya, terima kasih Bu Narti.
Can I say one thing?
Sure.
I want to thank you all again very much, and Ibu Narti, Ibnu, thank you very much for the opportunity. I also want to say that with this project underway, and with so many of you, and perhaps some younger researchers with interest in this area, I would love to have more interaction and connection between our academic institutions. And University of Toronto is a very welcoming place. And someone was asking me earlier beforehand if I have any Indonesian students now in Toronto. I do not, and I would love to. And so if we can establish more connections and get more people involved in this interesting area of study, I would love to do so, and feel free, anyone on this call, to be in touch with me.
Thank you very much, Pak Joshua.
Our prospective student is the one who moderate this.
Perfect.
Thank you very much, Pak Joshua. Untuk peserta semuanya, terima kasih sekali lagi sudah hadir dan sabar sampai menjelang jam 10 malam ini. Juga ini adalah bagian dari seri-seri diskusi yang masih berlangsung, jadi tetap simak akun Instagram kami @pmblipi, sedikit promosi, karena ada event-event diskusi berikutnya dan webinar-webinar lainnya yang relevan dengan topik ini. Terima kasih sekali lagi semuanya, selamat malam, selamat pagi untuk Pak Joshua dan juga Unika tadi yang jauh di sana. Ya, terima kasih.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih, Jos.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih
Sampai
semuanya.
ketemu lagi.
Terima kasih banyak. Ya, sampai ketemu lagi. Nanti kita keep in touch ya.
Terima kasih semuanya. Sudah difokus semuanya.